Misha and Dianne watch Santa Barbara from Miami. Welcome back to Misha and Dianne watch Santa Barbara.
Hello.
This is week 18. We are back from our trip to Florida. Week 17 was shot entirely in Walt Disney World at the various parks. And before that, we were on the Santa Barbara 35th Anniversary Reunion Cruise, which was very exciting, and we will do a special episode all about the cruise coming up. And I also got an exclusive interview with Nicholas Coster while I was down there. So we will be putting that online as well in the near future as soon as I finish editing it.
Yeah.
And let us get back to the swing of things. Last week was a short week because of Thanksgiving, so episode 85 is now a Monday episode. And it originally aired November 26th, 1984. And let's just start off with Mr. Bottoms. He is trapped in room 4 with a hooker, and she somehow manages to take off his jacket. And also manages to fondle him for quite a while as things are happening outside the room.
They're rolling around on the bed at one point.
Yes, well, in the adjacent room, of course, as you remember, the crooks have found their money in the wall, but they're more distracted by what they can see through the keyhole. I'm just going to turn it slightly. And outside, a police officer arrives. Now, the kids had realized what was going on in that room. Danny had wanted to take photos, which none of the others could think would benefit them in any way.
He does have a camera on hand, so this isn't just an idea. He has a way of executing it.
And the police officer is actually looking for the hooker. So they say she's in room 4, but she's with someone. He assumes it's the John. So inside the room, the crooks manage to lose their balance and fall into the room, spraying money everywhere, which causes Mr. Bottoms and the hooker to lose their balance. And so he ends up on top of her on the bed, just as the police officer bursts in.
And there's money flying everywhere.
There's money flying everywhere. Now, the police officer kind of ignores the two people dressed like Scooby-Doo criminals in the corner, is focused more on the hooker that he's come to arrest, and asks for the ID of Mr. Bottoms. Well, it's in his jacket, which is, was previously removed, and one of the crooks gets the jacket for him and gets the ID out, but switches it for his own. So when Mr. Bottoms hands it over, the police officer sees the name of the crook and knows that person is wanted for a bank job, and so arrests Mr. Bottoms for that. So meanwhile, Danny's taking lots of photos, and as they're leading them out, Ted decides to vouch for Mr. Bottoms and says, "Oh no, this isn't that guy you think it is. This is Mr. Bottoms, our headmaster at Lyman Prep," and he says that he was actually helping us with the sting operation to catch the robbers. So the policeman buys that quite easily. So then he arrests the other two, as well as the hooker. And he says there's a big reward out for them.
Yeah.
And Mr. Bottoms is anxious to grab that reward. But
his eyes light up.
Jade says, which Mr. Bottoms has kindly offered to donate to earthquake relief. So he agrees to that, because I think he knows they have something on him. So the police leave with the three. And Mr. Bottoms demands the camera, the film in the camera. And Lakin and Danny and Jade basically push him to agree not to torment Ted anymore and not to threaten to have him sent to military school in exchange for the photos. And he agrees to that, but as he's leaving, he says, "But I still don't agree with this place."
And they don't actually give him the photos.
They don't. They still have them.
It sort of ends in a standoff with Mr. Bottoms basically saying, well, I know what you were doing here, running this hotel / flophouse / brothel, whatever entertainment place, and with Lincoln and Tad and Danny and Jade saying, "Well, we've got the photos," so it's kind of a standoff.
So IMDb tells me that this is actually Ray Walston's last episode on the show as Mr. Bottoms. I don't recall them ever recasting, so it sounds like this has wrapped up the second story that the kids have been in, and the third one as well, because Lakin and Ted afterwards in the motel say, "Why don't we wrap up this frisky business?" And so that storyline has come to an end too.
And it actually wraps up the little sort of mini storyline which ran around Halloween, where Jade and Danny thought that the hotel might be haunted, and that's when we first saw the robbers, and so this wraps up their storyline too.
So we've wrapped up 3 things, and it's the last week of November, so I would have at least thought that they'd go to the end of the semester, so I don't know what storyline these 4 have in store for them now that, made it so urgent to wrap it up before the holidays, but we will see what adventures lie with them. I can't imagine we'll see them at school anymore unless there's another teacher.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
So, Cece is arguing with Santana over the usual things. And she says that she's pretty sure Cece is going to insist on picking Gina's future suitors so that the wrong person doesn't become Brandon's stepfather. In his room, Brandon asks Gina if Cece is going to be his new stepfather. Gina suggests they keep that idea between themselves.
Yeah.
And then when Gina goes down to talk to Cece after Santana leaves in a huff, Gina starts talking about what a great father Stockman was and how great it was that he was an older man. And he was a much better potential stepfather for Brandon than any of the younger men she's dated. So she says, I think if I do date again, it will be a man who's exactly like Stockman. So this is basically Gina, in Gina mode, making sure that Cece gets the idea that he could be her next husband.
Yeah, she's basically really buttering Cece up. And when I was watching this, I was wondering if this was something she had already basically performed years ago with Stockman, if this sort of gives you a little bit of a hint of how she raised herself up from her clerical role or whatever else. We got a hint from Summer a few episodes ago that there may have been a bit more to Gina's rise. If maybe this is the kind of performance she also gave to Stockman to win her place as his wife. So get a sense that she's actually done this sort of thing before. She seems pretty confident in doing it.
It'd be interesting how much Summer knows about how Gina is.
Yeah. I also wondered watching it, and I guess we'll find out as things unfold, if Santana really has much idea about, whether this is something that Gina's been angling for, if that would be something that would upset Santana, because, she seems to be pretty much pretty set in that she's not going to get back with Cece or whatever, but we've seen hints up to now that she's still got some residual feelings for him, and she and Cece definitely they're pushing each other's buttons a bit, which makes me think there's still a few unresolved emotions there.
Well, Gina had, talked to Santana about, are you sure it's over between you two? And they kind of hinted that maybe she might be interested. So
yeah, I'm sure it wouldn't come as a complete surprise given that conversation, but I'm just wondering if Santana's aware of how stealthily Gina is moving on this.
Now, in the rest of the city, most of the people are watching the same news report. They're watching a news anchor report the shocking news that Joe Perkins has been declared innocent of killing Channing, and that the murder investigation has been reopened.
And this actually harkens back to, when in the 80s and the 90s, before, media became so diverse, people would actually be watching the same telecast.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have, as we've said before, you didn't have 24-hour news, so your newscast was something that people would all be watching at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So Dominic is one of the people watching, and she immediately wonders what else Peter knows. The newscaster mentioned that Peter Flint had made a statement. So Dominic goes to visit Kelly to find out what else Peter said, and Kelly basically says that he named someone else, but she doesn't want to say who because it'll be quite shocking to a lot of people. So, of course, Dominic thinks it's Lionel, and so says to Kelly, "Oh, don't worry, I already know who it is, and I'm gonna go and see him." So Kelly's a little bit confused by that, I think, by that revelation. Augusta too is worried about the newscast because she thinks that now might shed a greater spotlight on Warren. But Lionel says, "No, Warren's innocent. We don't need to worry about this anymore."
Yeah.
So Dominic calls to arrange a meeting with Lionel. Of course, Augusta answers. And Dominic says, "Oh, I need to talk to your husband. He met with my wife yesterday," or whatever.
Not a good thing to say to Augusta.
No, so she demands to know, what were you doing with this man's wife? Why does he want to see? And Lionel says, "Oh, it's a business deal. It's a real estate, deal." And then she pushes him a little more, and he says, "Well, okay, remember how I told you I thought someone was trying to drive me crazy? Well, I think I'm on the verge of finding out who that is." So Augusta's not quite buying that anymore.
No, I don't think Augusta is really very interested in Lionel's whole line of thinking about being driven crazy by someone. I think she's kind of impatient with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think she suspects a lot more sort of play going on than that. I think she would see that as an excuse, maybe.
So she says, "I'm just happy those coins are out of the picture." So cut to Lionel arriving at the cemetery. He tries to dig up the coins for whatever reason, and they're not there. And he's quickly finds out why, because Dominic steps out of the shadows and says, "I have your coins." And Dominic tries to force Lionel to admit to killing Sophia, and he wants to know who Dominic is, and she said that I was a friend of Sophia's, so that now makes some sense. Why in Lionel's head, I think it's going to be a little less weird as to wonder who this person is. And then Dominic also tries to push him to say that he killed Channing too. So Lionel says, "Now you're trying to pin that on me too." So Sophia actually says that Lionel kept coming back with the boat to try and make sure she was drowned. So this is an interesting difference of opinion as to what happened on that day.
As I was watching that scene, it just occurred to me that the whole shredded swimsuit part of the storyline seems to have fallen by the wayside a little bit. Because that was a shocking thing a few weeks ago when Augusta found the swimsuit and was posing for Lionel in it, and it doesn't seem like they're quite as interested in that anymore, and that's probably because of the revelation during the earthquake that when Lionel confessed that he had been with Sophia. But still, it is a very dramatic piece of evidence that I don't think I would forget about that quickly.
And either way, it does sound like Sophia was underwater for a long time. Another storyline that maybe was dropped a few weeks ago. Didn't Mason say to Dad, "Oh, you're supposed to be hosting that charity function," and then Cece had said, "Oh, Mason, you take care of that." Well, we haven't heard of that since.
We haven't heard of that, no.
Then we had the earthquake, then we had Thanksgiving, and then, or maybe the earthquake was around that same time. And now Christmas will be coming up soon, so I don't know if they've dropped that or if that'll still be happening.
And we haven't seen Joe Perkins for a while. It seems like he hasn't played. I mean, he's been talked about a lot.
Yeah, it feels like we haven't seen him.
It feels like, I know he has appeared not that long ago, but it feels like he hasn't. And I would still love to know who popped him on the head when he had Dominic at gunpoint way back. I think it was it like the third week or something.
Yeah, so that's another open-ended
Yeah,
thing. Now, Warren shows up at the hospital, and he questions a nurse about how Peter Flint is. She says he's not doing that great, but he's conscious. And then Warren starts questioning some of the reporters that are there about how Peter is. This prompts one of the reporters to think, oh, maybe I should burst in there. So Kelly is with Mason when they watch the news. And Kelly says to Mason she should make sure he goes to prison for 5 years, too, to make up for the 5 years that Joe spent in prison. So he runs out of there, gets through all these reporters, makes it into Peter's room. And then Peter's just taunting Mason, saying, oh, boy, I don't know, maybe we should talk to these reporters. Or what should I say? You know, should I build up slowly with all the revelations about someone was in there, or should I just say that Mason Capwell murdered Channing? What do you think? So one of the reporters does burst in, and Peter says, oh, Mason, tell him what I just told you.
I absolutely love the scenes between Mason and Peter.
Yeah, Peter, I think, looks to me like he is recovering. He seemed in very good spirits.
Yeah.
And he seemed a bit more with it than the nurse was told Warren. Because he is definitely, not groggy or
it might be that
anymore.
Taunting Mason just gives him something to live for.
So then Augusta visits Peter, disguised as a doctor at first. But I think we all knew it was Augusta because she said she was going to do something about it herself last time we saw her, and suddenly there's someone in Peter's room. So she wants to know what else he saw, and he says, I'm not inclined to tell you anything because, you're not really my friend. I saw how you treated your friend Joe Perkins, and basically goes through all the list of things she did to Joe Perkins. So Augusta does not get any information. So obviously she's interested in knowing whether he saw Warren in the study.
I always enjoy, too, how the show introduces Augusta when she's doing some of these wacky things. And we've seen this a couple times. In fact, we saw it with Augusta's very first appearance, where the show always starts by showing her hand, and it's always immaculately manicured, usually in
we saw Breeze first, the first time.
Long, blood red, or very elaborate fingernails. And, that was one of the first ways we started to get introduced to Augusta. And they reprise that a little bit in this scene where they show these elaborate fingernailed hands, obviously in a medical outfit, tending to Peter before they reveal who it is.
So I don't know if Augusta will get Peter to spill any more about if he did see Warren, or if he may know about Warren and Channing. Maybe he was hiding it behind the bookcase when Warren and Channing had meetings. He may know a lot about their discussions.
It seems like a lot of people have lost their leverage over Peter right now. I mean, Mason's not making much of an impact on him, and Augusta certainly isn't. I mean, he's already lost Kelly, so I guess that's not a really big issue for him anymore. I
mean, he's got the attempted murder against Joe charge and probably the planting the cocaine charge, but I think maybe he has some leverage over Mason that he could use to get Mason to drop it, but I don't know if... I think the DA is the person. We haven't met the DA yet, so...
No, we haven't.
We'll see. So Kelly, alone in her room, decided she's waited enough, so she calls the DA's office, talks to the secretary, and says, I want to talk to the DA. I have information about Channing's murder. And then someone has entered the room and hangs up the phone. Of course, it's Mason.
Yeah.
And he says, what were you going to tell the DA? And she says that the true murderer of my brother Channing is you. And that was the cliffhanger for the episode.
Yeah. And Mason looking quite disturbed.
Mm-hmm. I think. Yep. We'll see if Mason has a very happy Christmas this year. And that was the cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So, anything else you wanted to talk about?
Not really. Not that I can think of.
And I forget. Had you already done a guess as to who would leave next? I think you did. Way back when, just so we keep on top of it.
I don't think I guessed Mr. Bottoms. But I don't remember what I guessed.
I think, did you maybe say Summer again?
I might have said Summer, or I might have just said maybe a change in the actors. I think I'd guessed that Santana might change actors at some point, but obviously that hasn't happened. So I'm pretty sure I didn't guess Mr. Bottoms.
No. So I guess who's your new guest then for the next actor to leave?
Oh, see, some of them are still, if you see the credits rolling, some of them are still on there who we haven't seen for a really long time, like Veronica.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I assume she survived the earthquake by being on vacation.
Yeah, and Summer's still on there, even though, it seems like her story with Warren has at least gone into hiatus.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with Peter in the hospital, even if Veronica comes back from vacation, we wouldn't know because she's his secretary.
Yeah. So I guess I feel like unless it's a character we're not seeing quite as much of lately, like Jade's mom doesn't appear a lot, or a change in actor, as I speculated that maybe Santana would change. We certainly saw that with Joe a few weeks ago, and that did surprise me a lot. Yeah, that would be my guess, a change of actor.
Change of actor. And your guess of the character?
I'm gonna go with Santana.
All right. Guess you found out at the cruise that there were a number of Santanas.
I did. I found out a few things at the cruise, some of which I'd hope not to find out. But
yeah, unfortunately, one big spoiler, the one we feared.
Yeah.
So that's too bad.
But no explanations yet. So even though I do know a little bit more than I had hoped to know, I have no understanding of why that would be the case. So really, it's still a bit of a whodunit. It's more like a Columbo now instead of an Agatha Christie.
Mm-hmm. I think we still have about 13 revelations. So.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So I guess we have different ways that people leave. Like there's the, like let's say Veronica never comes back. Mm-hmm. In that case, I would probably just, like with Mr. Bottoms, I would know from the IMDb listing what their last episode is. Mr. Bottoms is a bit more obvious because his storyline came to an end, although, you probably as a viewer wouldn't have known till, January that maybe he's not coming back. Mm-hmm. With Veronica, we're in the same boat as the viewer. Does she come back or not?
Sally,
we haven't seen her since before the earthquake.
Yeah.
Assume she's okay in that beach house that Kelly forced her into.
Yeah.
Then there's those actors like Joe, where they suddenly recast them.
Yeah.
And then there's the actors who, like John Perkins, who die, or if someone leaves town, it would be in the same boat, because we'd know, if someone says I'm leaving town, then we'd know that actor's gone.
Yeah.
And then, so there's just the quietly not mentioned is the troubling one. So I'll use IMDb to flag those ones when I can.
I feel like, and obviously I don't know at all what the trajectory of the story is going to be, but I feel like it's shifting a little bit away from the whole Perkins saga, especially now that Joe's being exonerated. and shifting more to the sort of ins and outs with the Capwell family and with the Lockridges, and of course now with Gina in the mix as well, who I think will be a key player. And I feel like we're shifting away a little bit, as I say, from the Perkins, and even to a little bit from the Andrade family.
I mean, if you were the writer, who would you be excited to write for, Gina or Marissa? You know?
Yeah.
So, right now, Marissa has no story.
Yeah.
Jade has no story because that wrapped up. Well, maybe
we've already lost two Andrades who were mentioned once and never.
And Rosa and Ruben, I guess they're just peripheral to Santana's story. So there's a handful of people in the cast who don't really have a storyline that's driving them.
Yeah.
So, and I guess even Ted doesn't have a story now because we wrapped up.
But as a Capwell, he's got.
I'm sure they'll find something for him, and the people in his orbit then will hopefully manage to keep stories. Jade and Lakin and Lakin as a Lockridge could get her own storyline too. So.
This is something. It reminds me a little bit of what we saw when we watched Dynasty, and if you watch the first season of Dynasty before Joan Collins starts in the show, it's really set up as this huge epic battle and rivalry between two families, this wealthy family and this very poor, and this very poor working class family.
The Blaisdells.
Yes. And as time goes on, actually well before the first season ends, the Blaisdells have become less and less interesting, and the Carringtons are taking up more and more of the storyline and the screen time. And I sort of feel a little bit of that with this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even on Dynasty, Matthew Blaisdell worked for Blake Carrington, I believe, and then John Perkins worked for Cece. So there's a lot of parallels. Between Dynasty and Santa Barbara.
Well, and some shared actors as well.
All right, well, we're going to watch episode 86 now, and either do another podcast tonight or tomorrow after I get back from work. And we will soon have up something for the 35th anniversary reunion cruise and our exclusive interview with Nicholas Coster.
Yes, and some other treats.
We will see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
This week's spotlight is on Ray Walston, who played Mr. Bottoms, teacher of Ted, Lakin, and Jade at Lyman Preparatory School. Herman Walston was born on December 2nd, 1914, in New Orleans, Louisiana. He married Ruth Claver in 1943, and they had one child. Walston began acting in 1939, with his first credit being an episode of The Web in 1954. He appeared in movies and TV shows throughout the 50s and 60s, including several parts in the anthology series Suspense. In 1963, he took on his most famous role as Uncle Martin to Bill Bixby's Tim in 3 seasons of My Favorite Martian. Following My Favorite Martian, he appeared in episodes of The Wild Wild West, Mod Squad, Ironside, Mission Impossible, The $6 Million Man, The Incredible Hulk, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, the Cliffhanger segment Stop Susan Williams, and in movies such as The Sting, Silver Streak, and as the father to Robin Williams' title role in Popeye. Beginning with episode 38, Walston appeared as prep school teacher Mr. Bottoms in 11 episodes of Santa Barbara. His final episode was number 85. After Santa Barbara, Walston appeared in The Love Boat, Johnny Dangerously, Misfits of Science, Silver Spoons, St. Elsewhere, Superboy, L.A. Law, Erie, Indiana, Star Trek The Next Generation, Project Alf, Star Trek Voyager, and in the 1999 movie My Favorite Martian, starring Christopher Lloyd. Walston's final credit is 2001's Early Bird Special as Pappy. He passed away on January 1st, 2001, in Beverly Hills, California, at age 86.
Hi, welcome back.
Hello.
We've watched episode 86 of Santa Barbara. Original air date November 27th, 1984. So Cece tells Kelly that he wants to know who killed Channing as soon as Peter tells her.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Mason's looking around in the background during all this.
Mm-hmm.
Joe and Kelly visit Peter, and Peter apologizes to Joe for basically everything. He says, I did it for Kelly. Everything I've done all along is for her.
Mm-hmm.
So they just kind of deadpan let him talk.
Yeah.
They're not really accepting his apology, because really, how could you apologize for that?
I think they're just hoping if they let him talk, he'll eventually give him the information they want, rather than wasting breath arguing with him when, he's not well. And if he expires, they won't get the information.
Minx gives Brick a plane ticket home, one way. He says, are you giving me half a vacation? Or she says, well, you haven't made up your mind about the portfolio, so you might as well just go home.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, you gave me, several days. And she said, you shouldn't need several days. So Brick borrows the car and drives Joe, Jade, and Marissa to the courthouse. And Cece and Mason are there, and they're making a statement to the press about Joe and how terrible it is that they were taken in. The judge clears Joe of all the charges and admonishes Mason's office to find the real killer.
Mm-hmm.
Amy finds out she's pregnant, 2.5 months pregnant, so she does not want to go out with Brick, and he kind of figures she just doesn't want to date him, so he goes to tell Minx that he's taking up her offer and leaving town. He has to stop by Perkins' house again, because Jade left her sweater in the limo, or in the car.
Yeah.
And then Amy explains it's nothing to do with him. And so he changes his mind and goes to tell Minx that he will stay after all, but on his terms.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, no, he'll stay on my terms. And eventually they agree on some sort of balance. It's not really spelled out, though.
They seem to have reached an understanding. They seem to have a good rapport, even though I don't think they entirely trust each other.
One of Brick's requirements was that no one should find out that he's running the portfolio. Mm-hmm. Mink says, no, Lionel must find out. So they didn't come to an agreement over that either yet.
No, we'll see. We'll see. I'm sure Lionel will find out at some point. But see how it plays out.
Back at the courthouse, Cece offers condolences to Marissa about John. He reminisces about how he gave John his first job in Santa Barbara. Mm-hmm. John, another one of these characters who has an accent distinctly not Santa Barbara.
Yes.
Cece offers Joe a job with Capwell Industries, maybe working on the oil rig like his dad did. And Joe says, no, that's fine. Then he offers him $10,000 to start out on his own, and Joe turns that down as well. And Kelly and Joe announce to the press that are there that they are planning to get married. They just haven't set a date yet.
Yeah.
And then Mason asks Cece if he's going to allow that. He says, of course not. I didn't allow it 5 years ago, and I'm not going to allow it now.
So I think that whole little scene puts a lot of things in a certain degree of context. I think Joe knows CC well enough that he doesn't want to owe him anything. That's what I kind of took from it. And it did occur to me that perhaps part of the reason why Kelly and Joe were thinking of eloping in the first place was because there was some disapproval from the Capwell family.
Originally.
Yeah, and I don't know if perhaps that would be around the idea that maybe Joe, with his working class background, isn't good enough to be with Kelly.
I suspect that is.
Yeah, although it's kind of interesting though, because, Peter's background, who we know his real background was that he was a prostitute, but even his fake background, he was really just a teacher living in a studio apartment at Lyman Prep. So that wasn't really an auspicious background either.
Mm-hmm. He must have some attribute that Cece preferred.
Yeah, yeah.
But, Cece doesn't take any responsibility for what he did to Joe. Basically announcing that this horrible thing happened to everyone, including him.
Yes, that's right. And we don't really see a lot of Mason taking responsibility either. I mean, the press does pressure him a little bit and sort of says, "Hey, didn't you mess up?" But I didn't think in the judges' chambers that Mason really gave a lot of ground.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me think Mason was involved 5 years ago with whatever Cece's plans were in keeping Joe from marrying Kelly.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if we really know the full extent of what those were. That maybe there were more plans afoot to keep Joe and Kelly apart. Maybe Cece was planning to send Kelly away or something like that, or we don't know, and that maybe Channing's murder got in the way of some plans that were afoot.
I mean, maybe Cece and Channing had a plan together to keep Kelly and Joe apart, too.
Yeah, that's possible as well.
So Mason goes to visit Kelly. Joe's gone, but he says to Kelly he wants to make sure that Joe and Kelly are going to testify against Peter, which seems like an odd thing to come to visit her about. You'd think it would be a given. But then Kelly actually says, "Oh, maybe you should consider the fact that he saved my life when I was kidnapped and that he saved Cece's $1 million." So this makes me wonder if Kelly is actually, even though he tried to kill Joe, somehow going to come out on Peter's side, maybe against Mason.
It seems like Kelly, in some ways, I mean, what we've seen kind of unfold is that she's actually a little more shrewd and manipulative than she appears.
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe
I know
she's thinking she needs Peter on her side.
Yeah.
She'd rather Mason go to jail for 5 years for everything than Peter go to jail for trying to shoot Joe. Maybe weighing those two against each other. She's so angry with Mason.
Well, and Peter has information to give, and she doesn't know the extent of that information. Some of it could be really useful. She doesn't know quite what Peter has to tell her.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think you had commented, I don't know if you commented on this podcast or whether you were just commenting to me privately, that it's always shocking to you how easily Kelly lies.
Mm-hmm. I think I did mention that in the podcast.
Yeah.
And how believable she is.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about just how we've seen her character evolve so far, she came across at the beginning as this sort of very innocent ingenue, and we're starting to see that she's actually playing a lot more of the game than we might have suspected.
So I think if Cece and Mason think it's going to be easy to keep Joe and Kelly from getting married, maybe Kelly's already a step ahead of them.
Well, really, they've underestimated Kelly since she started to elope with Joe way back when.
Mm-hmm. So Mason goes to see Peter now and tries to talk Peter into telling the truth. And Peter says, "Well, you threatened me for many months." And Mason said, "Well, that was just threats. There's no actual negative outcome that you achieved or suffered." And but Peter's saying, "Yeah, you can lose your job. Cece's going to hate you. You'll go to jail." And he basically says the revenge is too sweet for him to give up now.
Yeah.
And so Mason says the world needs to know the truth. And then Peter says, as he has before, Mason's the one who's lying.
Yeah.
So this is, I don't know if that means Mason actually is lying about something or if that's just the stand he's planning to take, till his dying breath, just to stick it to Mason. So Mason gets angry and grabs him and starts shaking him around, and his IV falls out. And the lidocaine, I think it is, that's in the IV is keeping Peter's heart regular. We heard earlier from one of the doctors. That's what's keeping him from fibrillating again. So yeah, there may be some negative consequences of that IV falling out in the opening seconds of the next episode.
Well, we had a foreshadowing of this right at the beginning when we saw the doctors and the nurse hovering over Peter and putting in the IV and talking about how delicate his condition was, and if anything happened to the IV, then he would be in grave danger. So we knew from the beginning of this episode that one way or another that IV was coming out of his arm. Mm-hmm. It was just a matter of how it was going to be ripped out. And now we see that it was Mason who is responsible for that. Whether it does have grave implications for Peter, we won't know until the next episode.
Mm-hmm. Now, I didn't mention last time we had a song during Mr. Bottom's
That's right.
And the Hooker's adventures. We heard Private Dancer by Tina Turner.
Mm-hmm.
And this episode, we heard a song that I didn't recognize, but doing a search on the words, it sounds like it might be All Right by Christopher Cross, which came out in 1983.
Yeah, I think so.
So, we're just lucky that these episodes have not been pulled yet due to rights infringement.
A lot of expensive songs on these episodes.
And that pretty much does it. Skip through a lot of boring Amy Perkins stuff because she's so boring.
Well, you covered the main bits.
Mm-hmm. And so we'll be back after we watch episode 87 of Santa Barbara.
See ya.
Welcome back to Misha and Dianne Watch Santa Barbara.
Hello.
We've just watched episode 87. Original air date November 28th, 1984. And Augusta encounters Brick, finds out that he's quit. She had found the plane ticket back to Las Vegas. She begs him to stay, I think, just to be amusing. And he says, okay, you've changed my mind. And he says he's back. So Augusta's confused by that. Lionel and Warren are working on the Amanda Lockridge plans, and they find a room where they think there's a safe full of stuff. So they're very excited about what they might find in there. And Lakin comes in and says she hopes he's not planning to pin the sinking of the Amanda Lockridge on the Capwells. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, we're just going to bring up the log and we'll find out what happened. Then Lincoln demands to know what's going on between Warren and Ted. And no one wants to say anything, so she's very upset by that. Eventually, Lionel says, we don't want to tell you because we don't want you to have to worry about it. Mm-hmm. And she insists, so he says, well, Ted found out about something Warren did a long time ago. But that's as far as he'll go. So she goes off to find Ted. Ted won't tell her what it is either.
Yeah.
So she wants to be taken home. So she actually told Lionel it's put quite a divide between her and Ted.
I thought this scene was notable because it's the first time, or at least the first time I remember hearing that there might be jewels and other valuable objects on the Amanda Lockridge. We've only heard about the paintings before, and I know I certainly had some skepticism about how well those paintings would fare underwater for 100 years. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like there might be something a little bit more durable there, potentially.
Mm-hmm. So. Lionel says, or Warren, I think, says, won't they be damaged underwater? And Lionel says, jewels are never damaged by water.
Yeah.
Now, Amy spends the episode spouting gibberish, and then Brick comes over, and so she does that as well as whining. They end up dancing. He tells her he's trying to make her feel better by telling her about his childhood and how his mom was a clown when she was pregnant with him because she couldn't do the trapeze anymore, and all this pregnancy and baby talk is annoying Amy. We found out a bit more about Brick. He says that because Amy had said, I thought you were born in Santa Barbara, and he says, oh yeah, I was, but the circus was just passing through town. So And then he also mentions that his father left when he was 4 or 5.
So this bit of background on Brick might come into play later because we're all still trying to figure out what his connection is with the Lockridges and why Minx has been so determined to have him manage the family funds and why she sought him out. So this might turn out to be important. Amy's unexpected pregnancy is a little bit of a, I don't know, I mean, for me, it puts a little damper on things whenever it comes up because we don't really have any connection with the guy who was the father of the child. So it's not like he's a long-running character that we're invested in. And Amy's really only been on the show for a few weeks at this point, so we're not massively invested in her. And she and Brick are barely an item, so we're not really invested in their relationship at this point. So for me, I guess I'm having, obviously some sympathy for someone in her situation in general, but I'm having a little bit of trouble really investing in her storyline at this point.
I can't say I'm saying, I hope we find out what happens to Amy next time.
Yeah.
It's like they took a very, kind of, after all the exciting Santa Barbara things, they've taken a very standard soap opera plot and just plopped it in there with someone that we don't really care about. And, I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really even know that much about Amy. And, again, we know nothing really about the guy she apparently got knocked up by. We just saw him very briefly when her character was introduced. And he didn't seem like a character that had much staying power. So, yeah, it's an odd little storyline, I think.
Now, Peter is in his hospital room, and he says to Mason that maybe he will come clean if Mason announces what a wonderful guy he's always thought Peter has been.
Yeah.
So Mason kind of deadpan says, "Oh, yes, you're a great guy. I've always admired you, whatever." Anyway, Peter laughs. And then Peter starts to feel a bit unwell, and he realizes his IV has fallen out, and he can't reach it, and asks Mason to put it in, and Mason says, "Well, maybe if you record a different confession for me, saying that you lied about everything," and he pulls out a tape recorder, and then Peter appears to go pass out. I don't know if that was just a trick of Peter's to get out of it. But Mason goes to the IV and looks at it, and I guess you can't really shove someone else's IV in if you're not a doctor, probably. So he goes to leave, then thinks better of it and rings the call button for the nurse before he leaves. Meanwhile, Kelly comes over to try and see what's up with Peter and runs into a doctor who says, "Oh, he's in a coma." And she tries to find out from the nurse if anyone saw him, because she suspects Mason right away, but no one saw anyone in there. She ends up then getting dressed, sneaking out of the hospital, and going home to the Capwell mansion, her old home. And then she runs into Mason and says that she knows Mason saw Peter, and she says, "So the only thing you had left to do was pull out that IV that was keeping him alive." So Mason says that he wasn't there. And Kelly says, "You are a monster, Mason." In that way only Robin Wright can say. And she says she's going to tell Cece. And Mason says she's making a mistake. Kelly says he's a dangerous man and should be punished. Mason says if she tells Cece, their lives will never be the same. And he says, think of the headlines. So that's an interesting tack to take. I mean, obviously Kelly wouldn't care, but I guess Kelly would know that Cece would care. And then he begs her not to do it. Santana's there also. She's apparently working with Eden on the hotel lobby. And, apparently they don't have the same tastes. So.
No, that's not surprising. They don't seem very similar. And they don't really seem to like each other very much. So.
Cece tells her he'd appreciate it if she didn't meet Eden there and didn't come to the house again. So Santana mentions Eden hasn't moved into Peter's office yet, so clearly that's the plan for Eden to move into Peter's office. So then Cece wants Mason to put Joe Perkins under surveillance. He wants to find out if anyone hires him, and if so, he'll decide whether he can keep his job. So Mason's actually a little annoyed by this. He says, can't you let Joe and Kelly be happy for a while? Cece says, you should be concentrating on finding Channing's real killer. So Cece's not taking any wise counsel from Mason on the Kelly and Joe front. Then Cece takes some time to snipe at Santana by saying that she's only seeing Mason to get closer to Gina, which doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah, that was
and also to get back at Cece. And she says, you know what, I don't have any feelings for you at all. So she says Mason has qualities that Cece doesn't have.
He's younger, for one thing.
And Cece says he doesn't believe a word she said about Mason. Later, Mason goes to Santana's apartment and says things are about to blow up again and wants to spend the night there. So, seems likely that Santana could say yes to that.
Yeah, she seemed quite tender to Mason in this episode.
So, they might spend the night together. Kelly finally gets Cece alone and tells him that even though he's been terrible to them, she wants to talk to Peter one more time. She says she has learned something about someone that makes her hate him with all her heart.
She often says that about people.
And that was the end of that.
That was the cliffhanger. So we don't know what she'll tell Cece about Mason.
Could this blow the whole show apart?
Yeah. I mean, I guess a couple things occurred to me during this whole section. First of all, I wondered if it was really in Mason's best interest to let Peter die. On the one hand, Peter's been threatening him and egging him on and can tell all kinds of lies, but he is also someone who has already come out and said some things, at least to Kelly, implicating Mason, and so is therefore the only person who could be walked back from that. And given all the stuff in Peter's history and the way he's, I mean, it's one thing for him when he's sick and on his deathbed, but I can't believe Mason wouldn't be able to work out something with him. And we know Peter's pretty greedy and pretty, he's got a pretty loose idea of morality. I mean, I'm sure there would be some things Mason could do to influence him, which of course is not an option now if Peter is in a coma and if Peter dies.
I'm wondering if Mason thinks the chances of Peter saying something worse about him and then dying
that's another
outweighs
thought.
the possibility of him just dying and then all he has to deal with is Kelly, who's a family member. Plus, he still can say, oh, Peter just said that to spite me because he saw me in the mirror.
That's true.
So maybe he thought that was the smaller obstacle to overcome than to let Peter continue to say things to other people.
Yeah. The other thing I think this episode really brought home to me anyway is how the various Capwell children, they can be each other's worst enemies and also their greatest allies. And we see this sort of play out in a lot of different ways in this episode. On the one hand, we know that Cece is not really keen on Joe and Kelly continuing together and is still looking for ways to get back at Joe, or at least keep them separated and keep Joe out of the picture. And Mason's the one who actually kind of intervenes in that. And we've seen Kelly intervene way at the beginning of the series where, Mason was on the outs with Cece when he named Channing instead of Mason at this big party for Mason. And Kelly kind of stepped in as a mediator on that. So they can really be allied with each other, and yet they're also each other's own worst enemy. We saw Mason play such a huge role in breaking up Kelly and prosecuting Joe, and now we see Kelly going to CC and basically implicating Mason in Channing's murder.
I think, Mason's hope is that, they can contain it within the family, which may be why they haven't showed Joe this week.
Yeah.
Because it would be undercut the believability a bit if we knew for sure that Joe knew what Peter said about Mason. Because Joe would probably not, how many days has it been? 4 or 5? Joe probably wouldn't keep quiet. Although Kelly, said Joe got a job, or Joe's getting a job or something. So Kelly and Joe are in touch a lot. It's just that we haven't seen it. Maybe that just to make it more believable that the secret hasn't gotten out yet after all these days. And that is pretty much it for this episode.
Yeah.
We'll return after we watch episode 88 of Santa Barbara.
See ya.
Welcome back.
Hello.
We finished episode 88 of Santa Barbara. Now, Mason has left a note for Santana to find wrapped around her orange juice. After spending the night with her, Rosa comes over and Santana quickly hides the extra pillow so that Rosa doesn't know Mason spent the night. And Rosa warns Santana that Mason is dangerous and that she's always been afraid of him. I think this is something the writers have put in to amp up the, potential that Mason is the killer.
Yeah, I think so too, because even a few weeks ago, I think that Rosa's attitude towards Mason was a little bit different. I mean, remember way back when Santana was first starting to flirt with CC, and Rosa mentioned something about, I think, always sort of thinking of her as being more with Mason. So, so this is, I think, a little bit of a change in tone from Rosa.
Mason opens the secret panel behind the bookcase, so we actually see it for the first time
we
in,
know where
in
it
use.
is.
It's one of those 3 bookshelves along the side of the study. And he doesn't go into the secret passage at all. He just reaches in and pulls out another key. So he gets the key to the passageway from a book, opens that, and just opens it a little bit, and then reaches in and gets another key. So I don't know if that key is to open the passage from the other side, and he's trying to lock off access to it, or if it's a key to something else.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting to see what that is the key to.
It looked quite similar to the first one, a gold key, kind of about this big, but with a fairly ornate, almost like old style door lock size. So I remember being excited as a kid about a secret passage. So
Oh yeah, secret passages are always fun.
So looking forward to more of that. Then Mason barges into Kelly's room and just admonishes her for telling Cece all about what Peter said. And she basically says, well, I haven't told Dad yet. So, but it doesn't matter because Cece is in the hallway and he overhears everything.
Yeah.
And he barges in and demands to know the whole story, and Kelly says that Peter said Mason was in the study after Channing was killed, but before Joe came in, and Mason is kicked out of the house by Cece. So, of course, Mason's angry that he believes Peter over him.
Yes.
Then Cece's angry with Kelly for not telling him immediately. Then he goes to his lawyer to have Mason removed from his will, which is another thing I found exciting as a kid.
Yeah.
I always like it when someone's removed from a will. So I seem to remember this was a great will storyline, but then maybe there were several will storylines over the years.
Sure
I just remember Cece's will was a fun thing.
Yeah.
So I think, did that happen on Dynasty? I think Adam got removed from Blake's will at one point.
I think at some point.
Anyway, I remember Mason at one point saying, "Where there's a way, there's a will, Dad." So, looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Sometime in the next 5 years. Now, the other thing he tells the lawyer is not to split Mason's share up amongst the other 3 kids, Kelly, Eve, and Ted, but he has a 4th recipient in mind, and he wants to keep that a secret from the family.
Now, I was guessing it might be held in trust for Brandon.
That's what I was thinking, too. It makes sense for it to be Brandon.
And actually, when I think about it, that wouldn't be a strange thing to do anyway if Brandon was Channing's son, because, that's what one does often in families. If one sibling has died, then their share gets passed on to their children. I think the complicating factor in this is that no one's supposed to know that Brandon is Channing's son.
Yeah. I don't know what if Cece's planning to keep that from the family forever. I mean, he knows that Ruben, Rosa, and Santana all know. So, any of them could tell the 3 kids at any point if Cece died, right? So.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, because, I mean, what does it matter if the others know, really? It was just, I think, to keep it secret from Santana and, get the adoption all sort of underway and finalized, and,
Unless he's still concerned about the optics of his son having a kid with the maid's daughter. I mean, that could
maybe.
be it.
Or the series. Maybe there's some other stuff involved there too. I don't know. But just logically, looking at it right now, it seems like he's being a little bit overcautious around that.
Now, the lawyer warns him that the will could be contested if he just cuts Mason out.
Yes.
So he says he should leave in a nominal amount, like $10,000. Cece agrees, but he says he doesn't even deserve the $10,000.
And I have to say, just going back to the huge blow-up that Mason and Cece had, and Cece found all this information out when he overheard the conversation, I do find Cece's attitude a little bit disingenuous, because if I recall, especially around the Peter setting up Joe Perkins thing, that all came about after CC was stomping around saying that he wanted Joe Perkins gone and to do it any way possible. So I do find it just a little disingenuous on CC's part that he's suddenly upset with Mason for potentially being involved in that.
He says to Kelly, "Oh, I can't believe you kept Joe in prison all these years falsely and prosecuted him and then set him up for the cocaine." And, Cece was basically involved in all of that.
And driving it. And, he's the head of the family. Mason, he knows, is going to do what he wants him to do. I mean, that's been Mason's pattern all the way through. That's where part of the simmering tension and intensity in Mason's relationship with CC comes from. That's why they're in this bad place right now, because Mason feels he's done everything CC wanted up until this, the beginning of this series.
I think Kelly knows CC was involved. I mean, she's not showing it, but then she's really good at keeping that kind of stuff in. So I suspect she knows that a lot of that was CC and Mason working together.
I think so too, and I think it is actually significant that Kelly didn't tell Cece when she had the chance last episode. I would be kind of curious, because when we saw her at the end of last episode, she was primed we thought, to tell him everything, and then she held back. And I would be kind of interested to know why she made that decision.
Yeah. I think maybe another conversation between Kelly and Mason would clear that up, or even between Kelly and Peter.
Yeah.
We might find out something about that. Now, Ted gets the cold shoulder from Lakin when he calls to offer her a ride to school, and Ted goes to Kelly and says, "Oh, my relationship with Lakin is being destroyed by this, the secret of Warren's." And then Kelly says, "Well, I think we know now that Warren didn't kill Channing.
Mm-hmm.
And that Ted gets elated when he hears that news.
Yeah.
He runs right over to the Lockridges and apologizes to Warren. And says he had bad information.
Yeah.
And Warren shakes his hand, and Warren's happy.
Yeah.
And Lakin agrees to the offer of a ride to school, and they end up pulling over and making out.
Yeah.
So
that has healed that situation.
Now Jade finds out that Amy is pregnant, because she drops all her pregnancy books on the floor. Amy tells Brick that she has something to tell him that will send him running, and then she decides against telling him. So,
can I just say I love, throughout this series, how much I've loved Jade's outfits. And look.
She had an amazing thing on.
Yeah.
And Amy had a horrible thing on.
Yeah, well, I think they're trying to make Amy look more pregnant. But Jade looks like every girl I went to high school with in the early 80s. And I think they got her look and manner just right.
So Warren wonders about Brick's duties and ends up trying to snoop a little bit on some of the documents Brick's working on. Holds up a sealed envelope to the light to see if he can figure out what's in it.
Now, we should say that when Warren comes in, I don't know how much he overheard, but Brick was actually in the process of, I guess, talking to a stockbroker or something.
Placing an order.
Yeah, and so he's actively now managing the Lockridge finance, portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if Warren overheard any of that, but definitely Warren is suspicious of what Brick is doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now Santana and Mason meet up again, and she says that she never got along with Eden, which you already knew, but basically she's not she and Eden are not seeing eye to eye on this this hotel lobby makeover. And then Mason says that Peter has turned his entire family against him, and he tells Santana the whole story. That Peter says, "I was in the study, and that was implying that I killed Channing." And Santana says she believes that Mason didn't do it.
And I found that really interesting because from what we saw, in this episode, it does appear that she does believe him. And that's a very different reaction, as she says herself, to when Joe first came back and she just went nuts and grabbed a gun and headed off to the bus station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she actually, when she finds out that Joe didn't do it, she's horrified about what she did, and that she nearly killed him.
Yeah.
So that conversation is happening at Mason's office, which I don't know if we've seen it before.
We have. Well, we've
once.
seen him in his office before. Remember, early on, he had that great scene where he was making out with his secretary,
and
right. Cece wanted him on the phone, and he was ignoring his calls, so Cece marched over to his office.
That's right. So we've seen the office once or twice.
Yeah.
Maybe the third time we've seen it. I feel we're going to see it more.
If Mason's not in the house.
Got some duties at work to find the real killer, so he might be in the office more. The DA might barge in and give him some orders soon.
I'd like to meet the DA. We haven't met the DA yet.
It's interesting, if Mason's thinking of becoming DA next. I don't know if the other DA is really old and going to retire, or if Mason's thinking of battling him for the role.
He actually seems, just thinking of the real politic in the world of work, Mason does seem to be given a lot of leverage, and like in so many workplaces, the assistant works so closely with the boss, and in this case, we haven't seen the boss at all.
Wonder what their relationship is like.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe CC contributed to the DA's election. Maybe he's in CC's pocket too. So the letter arrives at the office from CC, and a secretary brings it in. That I don't know if it's the one we've seen before. I think he called her Mavis or something. And opens the letter and tells Santana, "Well, my father's just disinherited me." So, yeah, so that was the other thing. He told the lawyer to specifically draft up a letter telling Mason that he was disinherited, just to push the knife in. Mason barges into the study at the mansion, and no one's there. And then Rosa, hears him and comes in, and he tells Rosa that Cece has cut him out of his life, written him out of his life, he says. And this is probably the last time that he'll be at the mansion.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'm not leaving without one last session with him. I'm going out with an explosion.
So this seems to back up Rosa's claim earlier in the episode that Mason is dangerous somehow. I mean, that's, as you say, I think the writers are kind of ramping that up a little bit. I actually don't blame Mason for being upset over this. I mean, all he's got really is, it's his, as he says, it's his word against Peter's.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see where, after all he's done for his dad, he would at least expect a little bit of a fair hearing or some reflection and contemplation before Cece takes this action.
Yeah, so Cece enters the study right at the end. So
Yeah,
I'm wondering if we're going to have an episode-long shouting match between Mason and Cece.
I think that's possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
looking forward to that.
And maybe one or two other Capwells.
We'll wander into the
I
study.
mean, we haven't seen Eden for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly's still around. She hasn't gone back to the hospital yet. So
Yeah, she said that she's expected back at the hospital, but I think they were going to discharge her the next morning anyway, so.
yeah, it's possible Santana may wander in. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. So that'll be the Friday episode.
Yeah, and that's often the cliffhanger day, isn't it?
Yeah, so
little
it's
bit.
the November 30th episode, and we'll be watching it on November 30th. So we've caught up with the we'd gotten ahead in order to have some episodes pre-recorded for when we were on the cruise, but now we've caught up with our backlog, so we're back to watching the episodes on the day they aired. So we're not actively trying to keep up with that as we were the first month.
Yeah,
But we'll definitely try not to get behind.
yeah.
But we have a couple of specials, that we could put in. Where we've got our exclusive interview with Nicholas Coster that we're going to be posting soon, and we're also going to work on a special episode just dedicated to the reunion cruise to give a summary of how that went. So that's coming up as well.
So you can see we're both wearing our little reunion cruise
Mm-hmm.
buttons.
Which was made up by one of the attendees,
Yeah.
Melissa Braverman. So
Yeah,
that
thank
was
you.
really great of her to make those buttons for everyone and bring them. So
we're going to have, I guess, at least one special episode.
Yeah. All right. We will be back after we watch episode 89 of Santa Barbara.
Bye-bye.
Welcome back.
Hello.
We've just watched episode 89 of Santa Barbara. Now, Lionel's interview about the Amanda Lockridge is playing on television.
Mm-hmm.
A number of people are watching it, including Lionel. And then Lionel makes a phone call to someone and tells them to get to Heathrow immediately. And remember to pretend that they don't know each other.
Ah, intriguing.
So this is another mystery phone call, like the one we had a few weeks ago that we never find out who the person on the other end was. Maybe it's the same person. But last time the other person was supposed to come immediately too. So
Yeah, we don't know.
Warren comes in and tells him that about Ted's apology, and they speculate that Peter Flint must have named someone else as the killer.
Yeah.
So Warren says that Channing was dead for a long time before he was shot. He says things like he had no soul, and a heart of ice, and his conscience was permanently turned off.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a flashback, quite a long flashback of Channing and Warren arguing. Channing saying that he's going to call the police on Warren as revenge, and that his dad will be happy, and it'll make the Lockridges look bad. He says, "You are stupid and careless, and you've lost."
And this is sort of the same of the flashback we saw with Channing and Peter Flint. And we're seeing a very similar Channing, not at all the angelic, good, fine son that CC has been talking about, and certainly not the wonderful boyfriend material that Santana's told us about. This is a very cold, calculating, and cruel CC. Or, sorry, Channing.
He says, this is going to be a gift to my father from me.
Yeah.
And this is going to be one of the best days of my life. And he tells Warren he's going to announce it at the press conference.
Yes.
That is happening later in the day, I guess, about his equestrian wins. And then, of course, he was killed before that press conference.
Yeah.
And Lionel says to Warren, the next time they're not going to arrest the wrong person.
Yeah.
So that makes me think that maybe Lionel thinks still Warren might be the killer.
It is a very interesting thing to say. I think it's a good observation as well. Yeah, but it does sound almost a little bit like a warning from Lionel.
Now, in the study, Cece tells Mason to clear out, and Mason just unloads on Cece about what a terrible person Channing was, which we now know. He says that Channing was spiteful and hateful and all these things. Cece punches him, and when he's down, Cece goes to the desk and pulls out a gun and walks over to Mason and points it at his head.
Yeah.
Mason tells him just to put him out of his misery. And then Cece goes to phone the police instead, and Mason says, oh yeah, that's good. Keep your hands clean the way you did by having me put Joe in jail and me, have Peter plant the cocaine.
So Mason's really throwing in his face a lot of the things we observed ourselves in this podcast about CC and getting Mason to do his dirty work, and the fact that CC really can't complain about the measures that Mason took against Joe because he was doing it at CC's behest. And if CC's honest with himself, he'll understand that.
And he brings up the fact that now he's trying to keep Joe and Kelly apart.
Yes, that's right.
So Mason says if Peter dies, nothing's going to happen to him because there's no, real testimony officially recorded anywhere.
Yeah.
So Cece phones the hospital and finds out that Peter is in a deep coma.
Yes, not doing well.
No. And they argue for quite a few scenes in this episode, and at one point Mason says he knows what his mother must feel like, and they talk about Pamela a bit, and Cece storms out.
Yeah.
And then Mason, cleverly, thinks the will might be in the desk. He quickly goes to the desk, pulls it open, and the will is there, and he checks, seeing that he's only gotten $10,000, but he sees that the rest of the money is going to Brandon DeMott.
So we called that. That.
Back in the atrium, Gina is telling Summer that she doesn't ever want to go back to the life they led before she met Stockman. So it's a follow-up to that little comment we had a few weeks ago. Warren comes to pick up Summer and takes her to La Mesa, and he tells her the heat is off him, and she tells him at one point when he's pressing her about her life that it was just her and Gina since she was a teenager, and that Gina had to petition the court to keep Summer from being sent to a foster home.
Yeah, so this is good information about Gina and Summer. We know that they don't have parents in the picture at all. It sounds like they don't have other relatives at all either. So it's just the two of them, and gives us a little bit more insight into, I think, Gina's will and her ability to survive.
Now, Eden goes to hire Cruz to check on Lionel's Amanda Lockridge story. And Santana tells Cruz that Gina is moving in with Cece, and Cruz suggests that maybe it was Gina's idea, which Santana hadn't thought of, but then quickly comes to think may be the case.
Yeah, and that's something we've been observing more and more. Gina's sort of slowly been showing her hand to us in the audience, but that's something that you can see. She didn't really reveal that to Santana, except to ask her about her status with CC.
Mm-hmm. Now we see Eden in her office, finally, Peter's old office. Veronica's back, and Eden tells Veronica to start keeping tabs on Lionel Lockridge and add to the file that they have on him. So as soon as Eden's gone for the day, she invites Lionel over to look through the file. And Lionel's kind of flabbergasted they have a file on him. And then tells Veronica to start one on Eden.
Yes.
And just as an aside, she says, and find out who murdered Channing. So she says Peter Flint said something. He says to her, Peter Flint said something in the hospital. Try to find out what it is. So.
Yeah.
At La Mesa, Cruz confirms to Eden that the Amanda Lockridge did shift. So it's likely they will be accessing it. And then Eden sees Lionel at La Mesa and confronts him about what he plans to do with that ship's log. And he says, well, whatever it says is going to be in the public record. And they end up talking more about Sophia instead, because he brings it up. But then again, she's wearing that sweater again,
I know, so. I was going to say, she's wearing that sweater again. So,
yeah, she says, why do you always bring up my mother? And he should have said, why do you always wear her sweater?
It's not really a very nice sweater. It's funny that that's one she's glommed onto wearing.
So they ended just talking about Sophia a bit, and Eden says, you must have been devastated when she was killed. That's the last line we have from that scene. Now, Mason is chatting with Gina, and he pretends he knows about the adoption. Gina says, I thought the family didn't know. He says, well, I'm a lawyer, so I do some paperwork for CC, but officially the family doesn't know. And he tricks her into revealing Dr. Ramirez's name. Then Mason goes to Santana's, mentions that he's been kicked out of the house, and she says that he can stay there, which I guess makes sense. He can't go to the Capwell Hotel. No.
That's actually a really good point. There's probably a lot of Capwell properties in Santa Barbara that are now off limits to him.
Mm-hmm. Can stay at the beach bar. No, that's not a hotel.
Or in his office.
So he says to Santana he's had his calls rerouted there for the afternoon. And phone rings, and it is for him. So Santana goes to give him some privacy. And it's Dr. Ramirez calling from Acapulco. And he pretends that Mason pretends CC's just out of town, but he needs some paperwork done with the DeMott adoption, and that he's found the mother didn't sign the document.
Yeah.
And Dr. Ramirez, we don't see him. We just hear a voiceover, so I don't know if it's the same actor or not. He says, I looked at those documents myself. And he says, well, Mason kind of just glosses over that and says, well, can you get her to sign it again? And he says, well, she's in Santa Barbara, you should do it. And I don't ever want to see Santana Andrade again.
Yeah, he talks about what a nightmare Santana was.
And that's how Mason finds out that Santana is Brandon's mother.
Mason is having a really bad day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is one of his worst days. We've seen him have quite a few bad days, but this is probably one of his worst ones yet.
Now, Mason had previously suspected that Cece was Brandon's father. So this new information that Santana is his mother may have just confused him a bit, because the things don't really jive properly. So we'll see how Mason processes this information next week.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we've seen the evolution of Santana's little brief romance with CC, and it's pretty obvious there wasn't much there before.
Yeah.
And I think Mason would realize that. And of course, he can do the math and realize who she was with around the time that Brandon would have been conceived.
And if CC has an interest in the boy, it's probably going to be very easy for Mason to connect the dots to Channing.
Yes, because if this was a son who had been adopted out and CC didn't really have much interest in him, then you could conclude that perhaps Santana had a relationship with someone else. But the fact that CC is so involved in the boy's life, that really indicates the relationship with the Capwell family. There's only so many candidates.
So, can Mason use this to his advantage somehow?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if he marries Santana and somehow tries to get a claim on Brandon,
Yes.
or if he tries to marry Gina out from under Mason, which would kind of piss off, or out from under Cece, which would piss off Santana, I should think.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two possibilities. Or there's just the act of revealing it too. I guess.
Yes, that's another thought. Or I don't know if he would be interested in some sort of blackmail at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's more Peter Flint's line.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, it would be interesting how Mason can use this information to his advantage.
mm-hmm. And can you imagine if Mason knew about that secret room? What he could do with the secret room in this knowledge?
Sorry, which secret room?
The one in the hotel.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll find out next week
Yeah.
when we
That'll
watch
be fun.
episode 90 of Santa Barbara.
Yes.
Week 19 next week.
Week 19.
See you then.
See ya.